Welcome to Racing Green live from Earthfest 2024. Today, our guest host, Maeve Campbell, chats with Dan McGrail, CEO of RenewableUK. They discuss the future of renewable energy in the UK, covering the vital roles of wind and solar power, the challenges of expanding renewable infrastructure, and the impact of renewables on our energy bills.
So I'll just give the audience a quick intro so they all know exactly who you are. So Dan McGrail is the CEO of RenewableUK, which is a trade association, the biggest trade body in the UK. He was previously CEO at Siemens in the engines department and has worked in a variety of roles across the energy industry. At Siemens, he led plans to develop and invest in offshore wind turbine manufacturing in the UK, securing a world-class offshore wind turbine blade factory and port facility in Hull, and negotiating with the UK government at the same time to oversee one of the company's most significant factory investments in its recent history. So, is that a good summary, Dan?
Yeah, it's okay. No, Renewable UK is we represent about 500 companies, and they are working across wind energy supply chain and investing in predominantly wind, but also in solar and other technologies. So we are now within the sort of low carbon energy space. We're the biggest voice and trade body in that sector. Yeah. So yeah, I think we've got a pretty important role in shaping government policy, but also hopefully persuading people that renewable energy is scalable. It's something that we can rely on in the future. And that's going to, that's a long journey. It's already been going for about 20 years. So we're just sort of right at the beginning of it. But, it's fun.
Well, I mean, it sounds very important work. So before we go into, more of the policy and more of the weeds, as you say, let's just define what renewables are. So what is renewable energy and why is it so important?
Well, I mean, there are probably 1,000 different definitions, but the simplest one is this is about harnessing electricity from nature, simplistically. And we've been doing it for a long time. If you think about it, we've been relying on the power of the wind for generations. Windmills and power in ships and things like that. So all we're simplistically doing with wind energy now is just turning it into electricity rather than into other forms of energy. And then obviously you can get power from the sun, from solar, and we maybe touch a little bit on the stories around that. But also in this country, for a very long time, we've generated electricity from water. Just use big hydroelectricity plants in Scotland and Wales in particular. But in countries like Norway has about 90% of its electricity comes from hydroelectricity. So, and that's it's a really established technology and something we've been relying on for generations. So there are a whole plethora of different sources of renewable electricity. And why it's important, well, I mean, we all know, and I suspect people who are here today are here because of the concern about the environment and about the planet. We, in this country in particular, we drove industrial revolution using fossil fuels. And I think many of the people who started that didn't necessarily realize what impact it was having. But of course, that industrial revolution went all over the world and many people copied it. And in countries like China, Indonesia, still very, very dependent on using coal for electricity. And, coal is by far the most damaging source of electricity generation we can find. But the other reason why renewable electricity, I think, is super important is part of this effort to combat climate change is not just about replacing the sources of electricity that we use today with renewable electricity. It's also about replacing how we power our transport and how we power our heat. And in this country, that's particularly challenging because the vast majority of us have a gas boiler at home. So, we've got to actually electrify all of these different types of energy that we use on a daily basis without thinking about it. And that means our electricity system is going to have to increase by fourfold. So, currently, I don't want to talk about numbers, but our installed capacity is enough to switch on our lights and use power our smartphones and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But about 40% of primary energy in this country is directed to transport. So we've got to have enough electricity to go for transport, and then we've got to have enough electricity to go for heat, which is hugely variable. We use a lot of energy in the winter, but not so much in the summer. So you need this really expandable scalable sources of electricity to meet those demands.
Yeah, and very high demand, clearly. So would you say, it would be a sweeping statement, but would you say renewables are our way out of the climate crisis?
They're the foundation. I mean, I wouldn't make it so simplistic, because I think if you can conclude that is the solution, then you could argue, well, we can just hand the responsibility over to policymakers and to big companies, and they'll change all the electricity. But there are other big sources of greenhouse gases which come from, for example, agriculture. There's a lot of conversation about how we make agriculture more sustainable. There are also other impacts like the nature impacts that we're having, and these things are connected. The fact that the impacts that we have in using a lot of plastics, single-use plastics in particular. So there are, I would say, behavioral changes and societal changes that are necessary to go with the changes we need to make within and how we generate and use energy.
Yeah. And so you're CEO of Renewable UK. So let's talk about the UK for a moment. What's our kind of energy mix at the moment? What do we actually rely on? Are we relying on coal? Are we relying on gas? Are we relying on wind in the UK at the moment?
So I've had a check this morning, and we're currently using about 65% of our electricity is coming from zero carbon sources, right? Which is pretty good. In fact, in the Western world, we're one of the world's leading nations at how we've taken carbon out of our system. About a decade and a half ago, about 40% of our electricity was coming from coal, and then another 40% of that was coming from gas, and then we had a mixture of other sources as well, including about, I'd say in 2010, about 7% was coming from renewable electricity. But today, 67% is zero carbon, 25% of that is wind. It's a pretty sunny day, so there's a bit of solar on the system, and also nuclear is considered as zero carbon. On Monday, it was nearly 90%, 89%, and 55% of that was coming from wind energy. So, wow. And over the course of a year, about half of, in 2023, about half of our electricity came from wind power, which is a phenomenal accomplishment considering where we were just a few years ago.
Wow. So in 2023, half of our electricity was coming from wind. Mm-hmm. And so what are the obstacles that we face in the UK in terms of building more wind turbines and more infrastructure? Because clearly it's something that we need. I don't think there's many people that would deny we need, especially in the UK, it's very windy. Yeah. We need to take advantage of that. What obstacles do we face there?
So I kind of break them down. I'm going to start with the one which gets talked about in sort of policy and governmental circles, but isn't necessarily in the public consciousness hugely, which is the electricity network.
Okay.
If you think about it, most of the coal in Britain was in the middle of the country. So we built all of our coal-fired power stations in the middle of the country, and we transmitted electricity out. Whereas if you get a lot of your electricity from renewables, you're going to build them in places where there's a lot of wind, mm-hmm. notably Scotland, Wales, and also offshore. The big majority of our wind power is offshore. So therefore, you build an electricity system which is going to transmit electricity from the extremities of the country in, rather than from the center out. And that means we've got to build a huge amount of electricity networks, also to take account of what I said earlier about this big expansion electricity that we need. So, we are reaching points now where if you want to connect to the electricity network in Britain, you'll get offered by National Grid a date somewhere in the late 2030s.
Okay.
So that is a big problem because there's just this massive queue. We haven't invested in renewable in electricity.
And we can't wait that long.
No, we can't wait that long. So there's a lot of reform that's going on about making sure that we can speed this process up. Mm. And that's actually, probably one of the areas or the biggest threats to net zero and decarbonisation in general. Because, being very frank with people, not many people want to house pylons in their local community. Mm. And those are sort of big challenges associated with that. So we've got to be doing it very sensitively. We've got to take our communities with us because we're buffering up against kind of the limits of how fast we can go without those big reforms.
Yeah.
The other area I think is public acceptance.
Okay.
And, I think we poll on this a lot and we do a lot of research to sort of test how people feel about renewables in general. And actually what we find is that about 75% of people are pro-renewables and would be quite happy to host it within their community. There's another chunk of people who are absolutely dead against it and really don't want it to happen.
And why would that be?
Well, they would usually to do with visual impacts. But it depends on the type of renewables and it depends where you go. So we have a ban, for example, or what we describe as a de facto ban on onshore wind in England, but not in Scotland and Wales.
Okay.
That came about, David Cameron put that into law in 2015, and it was done against this perceived lack of popularity, but it was only ever really a perceived lack of popularity within a certain sort of group of people, right? So there are things like, reforms there that we have to make, but generally people are concerned about visual impact. And there are, you mentioned myths, then there are concerns that people have about the impact on nature, and there are concerns that people have on the noise that's created by big wind turbines, right?
And if you did live, if you essentially had a wind turbine at the end of your garden, or on maybe just on the other side of your garden in a nearby field, what is the impact? Is it loud?
Modern wind turbines, you wouldn't build them close to someone's house.
Right.
I mean, simply, we wouldn't attempt. Our industry wouldn't attempt to do that because it would be insensitive. They're noisy, not compared to big power stations or motorways or other pieces of infrastructure which we rely on every day. Yeah. But they do make a noise, particularly when it's very windy. But we, as a sector, we would develop sensitively and make sure that you don't put something at the end of someone's garden, so on and so forth. And then the other area where there's this kind of narrative that the wind turbines kill birds, and that's actually a pretty significant myth. There are minor impacts, and what you tend to see, particularly when we go offshore, is you tend to see changes in migration patterns. So birds will maybe if they were nesting in certain areas, they will nest in other areas. So we have to compensate for that when we develop a wind farm, and the law makes the sector take decisions and invest in bits of infrastructure that compensate for these effects. They're also really, this is part of the technology that sits around this is actually pretty cool. So there are technologies out there now which use a combination of AI and imaging software to identify bird movement. So a wind turbine will have a camera which can visually see if a bird is going to travel towards it, and detect the species of bird, which will then inform how they would react to certain deterrents. So then it will issue a noise or a sound which would make the bird change direction and then keep it safe. So there's huge ways in which we're using technology to make sure that nature isn't impacted by renewables. Yeah,
that's really important. It's exciting that tech can help us with that as well, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So just to break it down. So we have onshore and offshore wind, which basically means on land or on sea.
Yeah.
What are the benefits or the drawbacks of both? Why would you have a wind turbine in the sea as opposed to on land? And is there one that's kind of works better?
Simplistically, size. Right? You wouldn't a modern offshore wind turbine is kind of the height at the tip of the shard.
Wow.
Right?
Okay.
So these things are massive. The blades, modern blades on those offshore wind turbines are, the latest machines that you can buy are 115 meters. Imagine 10 London buses in a queue and then another 10 on top of them. And that's you get into the kind of dimensions of a modern wind turbine blade. And so therefore, if you don't want to put machines of that scale onshore. But also when you get that big, actually, sort of the science of this is that the wind blows faster, higher. So if you go higher, and then you get better output from the machine. So you'll get wind energy from electricity from those machines offshore 55, 60% of the time. Whereas onshore, you have to build a smaller machine. So therefore it's maybe 40, 45% of the time. So that means you're just getting a lot more electricity from the same amount of space, more or less. But also you don't come up against some of the same public acceptance restrictions when you go offshore as well.
That would make sense.
So it's so we in this country, our government, the current government, and then if the Labour government was to come in, would be even more ambitious on building our offshore fleet. So Labour wants to quadruple the amount of offshore wind that we currently have operating by 2030, which is incredibly ambitious. And the Conservatives are targeting to get to, let's say it's not quite quadruple, say trebling. So it's still either way, it's pretty ambitious.
Yeah. So I really want to talk about the elections. I think we'll get to that in a little while. Still staying with the kind of more explaining side of things. Another thing that people seem to say in the field of renewables is the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. So, this is kind of intermittency, they call it.
Yeah.
And how do we deal with that? Because if the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow, then how can we rely on green energy to power our homes, our offices all the time?
And this is the most common challenge. So it's true. I mean, if you think of all those pioneers and inventors of brilliant technology over the last 4 decades who've built this, when you get that challenge, but the wind doesn't always blow, you think, well, do you think we didn't know that? It's a pretty obvious fact, but it is also a genuine concern about how you make an entirely renewable system. And I think, so let me break this down a little bit. The sun, and there's a term in the industry which is borrowed from Germany, I won't repeat it, but it's this idea of a dark day when the wind isn't blowing. Germans call it a Dunkelflaute, right?
Okay.
It's this idea of, there's no sources of renewable energy on those days.
Okay.
That happens about 7 weeks a year, right? So so you have to compensate for that 7 weeks somehow. And then, of course, in any given day, so in the rest of the year, you're going to get variability. So one of the things we have in Britain, again, quietly happening, which again, people don't know about, is we're building an awful lot of batteries. And dealing with that intraday issue, you will have times when the amount of renewable energy is greater than the country needs, and then the electricity effectively for free goes into a battery.
So that's on a really windy day.
On a really windy day, or in the middle of the night when we're not using much electricity. It's very windy outside, powering up batteries that you can then dispatch when you have the reverse happen. And that you use to manage within that 40 odd weeks a year when, you're managing the variability. And the rest of the time, we have to find other ways to get to net zero. So we have some nuclear power plants in Britain. We will build some more nuclear power stations, but there won't be very many, right? Because they're incredibly expensive and very incredibly hard to build. There's the subject of so-called carbon capture and storage, which is basically where you put a big pipe on the end of a gas-fired power station and capture the carbon emissions and put them usually into an old oil well that isn't being used offshore. And you probably need to do that a lot with industries, because we've got a lot of heavy industry that also produces a lot of carbon, like steel, glass, cement, all of these types of things. So you need ways to deal with those emissions. And what we will do is gradually over time probably use some unabated gas. So in other words, just a normal gas-fired power station with some emissions that will, have an environmental impact, but gradually using technology reduce the amount of hours in a year that we're using gas-fired power stations. And that's actually what's happening now. I mentioned earlier in the week, if you just think about it in a practical example, earlier in the week, it was 90% renewables. There's a little bit of gas on the system. Later in the week, we're at 65% renewables, and we have to put more gas on the system. So you're just flexing it. But over time, we just need to reduce that amount of gas.
Yeah.
The other thing I should probably talk about is what we call long duration storage, which is then when we take some of that surplus renewable electricity and turn it into something else, such as hydrogen.
Okay.
So hydrogen there's a big conversation in political circles about hydrogen at the moment, because it's an important source of energy and it's a way of storing energy. When you think about hydrogen, if it's effectively zero emissions when you burn it.
Okay.
You basically turn hydrogen, H2, and you mix it with oxygen, O. What you get is water. So,
H2O.
Yeah. So hydrogen's effectively another vector to move energy demand around between times.
Interesting. Okay. And just thinking about what, people will be thinking and, how does this affect us? How does this in our houses, in our lives? If we had more renewable energy in the UK, how would that affect our bills?
Well, the idea is that it brings people's bills down. I mean, if an hour of electricity bought out of a power station, one unit of electricity is about double the cost from a gas-fired power station it is from a wind turbine, modern offshore wind turbine today. So we're already half the cost of using gas. And actually, we saw this, and I know you wanted to talk about politics later, but you saw this in the response to the energy crisis 2 years ago. Countries around the world accelerating their move to clean energy. Big policy announcements by the Biden administration in America, big moves by the European Union to accelerate clean energy, and the UK as well did the same, increasing targets, increasing ambitions, and sort of changing policies to try and make things speed up. So actually, the route away from high-cost energy is towards renewables, and there are people out there who have this narrative of renewables are expensive and so on and so forth, and they put more cost on my bill. That actually now, today, that was true 10 years ago. It's no longer true. It's now the lowest cost form of electricity.
Mm. And so that's a good segue to kind of get into the politics. So at the moment, you said that in the UK, the Conservative Party, David Cameron, put in this kind of de facto onshore wind farm ban.
Yeah.
Which must not be a good thing. So how, if we have a Labour government, which is potentially looking likely this year, how's that going to change? Well,
I imagine they'll lift the ban on onshore wind in England on day one. I mean, I don't imagine that's what I'm asking them to do, right? And I think I think they consider it to be mad, because in the end, what that ban is doing is treating one piece of infrastructure completely different to any other piece of infrastructure. Just to say this de facto ban, what the law says is if one person objects to a wind farm, then it can't go ahead. Mm. Which, I mean, if you think about pretty much every development that happens in this country, someone objects to it. Someone objects to a housing estate being built, or a new shopping centre, or a swimming pool, or whatever it might be. Someone is going to object. Mm. So to have that level of scrutiny is essentially unreasonable, and treating that infrastructure completely different. All we want is to be treated exactly the same as any other big piece of infrastructure would be treated, as in having a sensible consultation process. And if a developer comes forward with something which is insensitive, then they shouldn't get consent. I mean, that's just absolutely clear. So I really think that Labour understand that desire for moving that forward, because there are some places in England where it's very sensible to build wind farms. Okay. Industrial areas which are not densely populated. So we should consider what those options are for sensitive development. Yeah. Yeah, I think that that's
and around the world as well. What's the appetite like for renewables? Because I was reading that today the world is still 80% reliant on fossil fuels, according to the International Energy Association and many others. 80% as a world, we're still reliant on fossil fuels. Yeah. That's a difficult fact to take in, because here we are at this amazing sustainability festival talking about renewables, talking about how important they are. But as a world, we're still 80% reliant on coal, oil, and gas. So how have we got here, and how do we get out of this mess?
Well, I'm sort of by nature an optimist, and I kind of look at what the UK has done and think, well, actually, we should be a bit of a beacon for countries to look at and say, this is how you can accelerate decarbonisation in an incredibly fast way. And you say incredibly fast, it's still taken us 2 decades to get this far, more or less, but that compared to other nations is pretty impressive. So if you're Indonesia, or China or Australia, or different coming from a different benchmark, but the world through the COP system, and I know lots of people. I went to COP26. I haven't been to COP since, because I can't justify flying to Abu Dhabi or wherever it was this time to do it. But, I think, the COP process has put in place commitments, net zero commitments, from something like 90% of the world's population. Mm. So are they all fast enough? Probably not. But the fact that we got, India to make significant commitments in the last COP, the fact that we've got China is the world's biggest producer of wind energy, and also the world's biggest producer of wind turbines, for example. We don't really use Chinese wind technology in Britain. Okay. But, they have accelerated their decarbonisation processes as well. The problem is, of course, population growth in certain those parts of the world has meant that they've built loads of coal-fired power stations as well, just to keep up with the growth in demand. So I think you've got to see it through the prism of time and go, well, actually, certain countries in the developed world have gone incredibly fast, and others in the developing world will go slower. But with international pressure and the systems that we have through COP, we will get there. And I think if we were having this conversation in 2030, the progress would not be linear; it would be exponential. You will see, it's taken us 30 plus years, 40 years, arguably, to get to 1 terawatt, which is incredible, basically an awful lot of wind energy installed. It will not take us 40 years to get to the next terawatt. It will take us 10.
Is that on a global scale?
On a global scale, yeah.
And so which countries kind of stand out from a renewable perspective? Well,
I mentioned Norway there as an example of someone who, has been relying on renewable energy for ages.
Yeah.
And we have an interconnector with Norway, which basically connects electricity. It almost acts like a battery because they can turn the taps on their hydro stations when the wind isn't blowing in other countries, and we can import their electricity. But Denmark, I'm going to call out Denmark because Denmark is really where wind energy started to really grow. Spain has gone incredibly fast. Again, people wouldn't be aware of that. That's a country, and Germany in a very different way. Germany has built lots of small renewable energy generation, whereas we as a country tend to build quite big power plants comparatively. So I think there are some really good examples. And sort of further afield, I think it is, it's probably a little bit controversial to say, but the speed with which China has put wind energy, it's got more installed wind energy than anywhere else in the world. So, you should actually acknowledge that and say it's pretty important.
Absolutely. And another thing I have to ask is, it's a bit like the electric car argument. We all want more electric cars, but it's quite energy intensive to make electric cars because you have to make the batteries and there's a lot of metal mining involved. So when it comes to kind of building renewable infrastructure, so for example, wind turbines or solar panels, is that an energy intensive process? Is that, does it pale in comparison compared to the positive effects that the energy produces?
So there are three things I'd say about the sort of the sustainability of the sector. So you rely, a wind turbine is about 55% steel today, and there are opportunities to change that materials that you can use more composite materials, for example, that will also help make them lighter, which also make it all cheaper. But so steel making processes are still incredibly carbon intensive. We want to be able to see more green steel being manufactured, and there are companies out there who are transitioning quite aggressively towards green steel within Europe, particularly some big European manufacturers. The second thing is then the operation of wind farms, in particular offshore wind farms, where you need to send people out on boats, which are typically powered by diesel engines.
Yeah.
We're doing a lot to develop electric boats, believe it or not, at the moment, or hydrogen-powered vessels, which will take us, into a lower carbon effect of the operation. And then the final point, and this is, I think, one of the big areas that again isn't well known, is early wind turbine blades, which I mentioned earlier, are massive. They weren't recyclable. So certain wind farms that have reached the end of their life, a lot of those have gone into landfill, and that needs to be eliminated. So wind turbine manufacturers now are working a lot on material sciences to make sure that the materials that are used in manufacturing wind turbine blades can be reprocessed and turned into something else, such as a sustainable building material or other things. And we're seeing really loads of innovation around that.
That sounds really important, contributing to a more circular economy, actually recycling the materials used. So, and what about solar panels?
So I think both solar panels, electric vehicles, and certain designs of wind turbines have a common issue around rare earth mining. Yeah. And there's a big concentration of rare earth mining in China. Parts of that mining, I think you could genuinely ask questions about whether it is sustainable and the practices are being done in a sustainable manner. So a lot of the manufacturers in all of these areas have got to look at how do you get other sources of these important materials and get them from places where you can put regulation in place to ensure that we're not mining in ways which are, exploitative, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. So another thing that I've been reading in preparation for this panel is, sadly, it seems that a lot of kind of renewables companies have been pausing projects over the last year and kind of cutting back, which I believe is due to rising inflation, things like that. Does that worry you?
Yeah, it's been my day job for the last couple of years. This is affected countries around the world, is that because of the energy crisis, the Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, the consequences of these international conflicts and the effect that's had on commodity prices, there's been a big inflationary effect, way bigger than we've all suffered with inflation in society over the last couple of years, but these big capital projects have had it much, much worse because they're exposed to steel or aluminium or nickel, and these materials shot through the roof during the period post Ukraine invasion, and government policies couldn't keep up fast enough with the inflation. So the amount that governments were willing to pay, it's not that they weren't willing to pay it, it's just that their systems couldn't keep up with the inflation. And what that meant is projects have gone on hold, they've been delayed. I think in 2024, genuinely, I think we've turned the corner, and we're going to see, an acceleration both here and in Europe, and to a lesser extent probably in the US. So I think we will see, the effects of that inflationary hiatus sort of pay through.
And are there many projects on pause in the UK at the moment?
There's a big offshore project which was delayed because of this effect. It's called Boreas. It's out in the North Sea, and it's a big project that Vattenfall were developing, and they had to back away from it because of the effects of inflation.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. So you're hopeful that in 2024 these projects will hopefully resume?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Okay. And so we're coming to the end now, but something else I wanted to ask you about was that sticking point of nuclear energy. So we're talking about renewables today. I know nuclear energy is controversial. Is nuclear energy a renewable? Is it classed as renewable?
I wouldn't call it renewable because of the fact is you are left with a residual fuel that you have to deal with. So I don't consider. I would call it as low carbon.
Okay.
And it is low carbon. We should acknowledge that. And it's an essential part, many would say, of a low carbon system.
Yeah.
I guess there are a couple of narratives around nuclear which are important to sort of bear in mind. The whole process of planning and developing a nuclear power station is just incredibly long. So when we had the energy crisis a couple of years ago, the government said, we want to increase the number of new nuclear reactors. We're going to build 8 new nuclear reactors.
Okay.
And I think they put a date on that by something like 2040. It kind of doesn't matter what that date was because no one can really know how long it will take. It just, the process is incredibly long, the safeguards that have to be put in place. And then you come to the cost. Nuclear is incredibly expensive. It's not... And I'm sounding like I'm being negative about nuclear here, so I'm going to check myself. It's still important to have multiple sources of energy. You don't want to just have exposure to one or two. We've seen what's happened with that.
Yeah.
In the effect of Russian gas and how that has affected everybody's lives. That dependency that Europe had on Russian gas has affected everyone's lives. So we don't want to create new dependencies. So you should have these other sources.
Yeah.
But you should also be sensible about the fact that it takes a very long time and it's very expensive to build nuclear power stations.
And many organizations, I think Greenpeace, for example, are against nuclear energy because they say, even though it's clean and it's low carbon, which I think is undeniable, there's still dangers of kind of burying that nuclear waste. Is that something that you all kind of for or against? Oh,
look, I'm going to pass on it because I don't know enough about it. Okay. I'm focused on what that sort of definition of renewable energy is energy from very much from sort of natural sources such as wind and the sun, and that's where my expertise are. So I wouldn't want to give people a sort of half-baked opinion on it. What I would say is we've had nuclear power stations in Britain since the 1960s. They've been by and large reliable, but when they fail, as in like, you know, they need big maintenance, the procedures and the processes and the regulation that sits around it in this country is world class. So it's not like we have people cutting corners, and it's not like anyone would take the risks with it. But that's part of the reason why it's expensive, and it's just it's comparatively, it's just a reality. It is just comparatively expensive.
Yeah, and France, for example, is hugely reliable.
90% nuclear, but
90%.
Yeah,
wow.
but a lot of the civil nuclear technology is French. So there's a huge, and the reactor manufacturers are, that's basically owned by the French government. So the plant that's being built in Hinkley Point is being built by EDF, which is Électricité de France, and the technology is Areva technology, which comes from France. So there's kind of a big national champion of French technology. So I think I think that's the reason why it's 90%.
Yeah, and they're the leaders really there. Yeah. Great. And so, just coming to the end, I know you said before that you're an optimist, which sometimes I find is quite rare in the climate sphere. So tell me more about why you're an optimist and are you hopeful for a cleaner future? Well,
because I think, we have, I'm not an engineer, but I've worked with engineers my entire career. And I believe in the ingenuity of people and our ability to engineer our way to better outcomes. We've done it time and time again. Ed Miliband describes his sort of mission to get zero carbon electricity by 2030 as a moonshot, right? We've had moonshots before and we did it, and it is, it's just humanity has this way of solving problems. We have got a pretty good way of making problems, and I think that's perhaps the area that the pessimists will focus on. But I just think that we can engineer and use technology to find our way through this crisis. And a lot of people, when you have that conversation in the pub, who will go, yeah, but surely just we've got oil and gas, and it's cheaper and what have you. I can just think. If you could get all of your power, all of your energy needs from the sun and the wind and the water, wouldn't that just be better? Isn't that just better for everybody? And I think that, we don't need to exploit the planet in the way that we have been. It's just better this way. And I think that's a hopeful argument.
And that's how you would convince someone down the pub, as you say, because I think that's an important way to look at these arguments, because people do have these conversations, socially, and how do we make sure that we're bringing everyone with us on this journey?
I think the difference between, if you look at nuclear or you look at coal or you look at things, one of the things about them where they were local impact but also local benefit. In other words, a big coal-fired power station like Drax in Yorkshire has hundreds of people who work at it, community centres, social clubs. It has a legacy and an impact on the community. And one of the challenges with renewable energy is that it's local impact, societal benefit, and doesn't. I think to that end, one of the things I think and I work really hard on to try and make it happen is to make sure that societal benefit and that balance between societal benefit and community benefit plays out.
Yeah.
We've got to make sure that communities that are going to house infrastructure, that are going to do things for the good of the nation, are taken with you, that they see benefits for their communities as well as the benefits for society. Because in the end, NIMBYism and, the challenges of sort of, people having to host stuff in their community, it does mean something to people and it can slow things down. So we have to make that pitch that for the good of everybody, we need to do this. But I think we also have to balance it with making sure that people see jobs, investment, and
training more people up.
Yeah. And that's one of the big stories about this, which we haven't really even touched on in the conversation, is offshore wind alone will create about 110,000 jobs by 2030. We have about 30,000 people today. So it's a big economic growth story behind it.
Yeah.
These are jobs of the future. So when people are saying to you in the pub, go slow, actually the story is these are the jobs that our kids and grandkids can benefit from. We're going to be a world leader in it. So we're going to be exporting things to other countries in the future, and know-how and opportunity. those are the things that people should tap into and understand, because then it becomes much more about, what's in it for us, for my family, for my friends, so we can see the benefits.
Yeah.
That's I think, the mission that we have to set.
Yeah. What a positive note to end on. Well, thanks so much, Dan. Let's give Dan a big round of applause.
Thank you.